process that really a lot of the public has best access to is CEQA. So what that does is, make CEQA kind of the opportunity to thumbs up, thumbs down a project for people who are, maybe on the outside of the quote system. And that's not really what CEQA was intended to do. It was supposed to be, one tool to analyze, to identify, to give decision makers information to both, look at the impacts from a project, but also create a better project. And when you, look at what, kind of CEQA has become, we've really strayed pretty far away from that.
Welcome to the Environmental Leadership Chronicles, a podcast brought to you by the California Association of Environmental Professionals. This episode features a podcast that we recorded live at the 2026 AEP State Conference with a panel on the abundance agenda, which is sweeping the nation and especially the attention of the political elite in Sacramento. Abundance is a book written by Ezra, Klein, and Thompson and offers an explanation of how to solve today's societal problems by overcoming systemic barriers and building progress. With a focus on the administrative burdens that government places on building nice things, it's no surprise that environmental regulations like CEQA and NEPA are discussed within the framework of the impact of regulatory environments on innovation and progress, the role of government in fostering a culture of abundance, and the intersection of policy and technology in shaping the future. As environmental professionals know, probably far better than most, it's easy to cherry-pick CEQA horror stories or salacious Arby's fish headlines. Our panelists and hosts leverage their experience working in government, lobbying, development, and consulting. And with the help of the audience discussion, we look to put a finer point on the abundance agenda and ask, what part does CEQA really play and why we can't have nice things? Thanks for listening.
Well, good morning. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here at 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning. So thanks and good job to all of us, right? We showed up. So thanks for being here. And hopefully you saw this, but this is a live podcast recording. So everything will be recorded. But we'll go ahead and start off and introduce our wonderful panelists. So I'm Jessica Sweenhauer. I am the podcast host for AEP. And I'll let you guys introduce yourself, starting with Corinne.
Hey everyone, Corinne Lytle, Bonine. I occasionally get to help Jessica co-host. I am also the Administrative Vice President of AEP, and in my spare time, I'm an Environmental Permitting Director for AES Clean Energy, looking at wind, solar, storage, et cetera, across the United States.
Matt.
Hi, everybody. Matt Klopfenstein. I am AEP's lobbyist up in Sacramento. So I have a firm up there called Summit Advocacy and have been lobbying for AEP and the AEP Legislative Review Committee for about 10 years.
Good morning. I'm Mindy Fogg. I'm the current AEP president. Excuse me. And I'm a principal planner with the City of Carpinteria.
Yay. Well, thank you to the panelists. Thanks for joining and participating and putting this together. So we want to be clear. This is not a book report. It's not going to be a traditional panel. We're going to ask you to participate, disagree, mostly agree. No, I'm kidding. But feel free. Opinions are great and help us shape the conversation as part of this panel and the podcast recording. So the book covers a lot of areas regarding politics, governments, history, but today we intend to focus on the topics related to permitting and building, CEQA, California legislation, and climate change. So the book says we have built a vitocracy, a system better at blocking than building. Does that feel true in your work? Let's ask the audience. What do you guys think? Does that feel true that we are better at blocking than building? Does anyone want to share? You'll have a microphone. Okay. Hold, please.
Thank you, Matt, going with Farron Pierce. This is the book that I was waiting for when it came out, and because I think it does offer a lot of practical advice. Because as a transportation planner, we have just been saddled with endless amounts of traffic impact studies for housing, and that is a practical bottleneck. And I think the bottleneck detector that they go through really helps practitioners kind of think about what are the bottlenecks to achieving the outcomes that our communities want. And I think they did a really great job of explaining that in the book.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. So for Mindy and Corinne, I'll start with you guys. What do you think about that question? Are we better at blocking than building?
I think it's probably more complicated than a blanket yes or no. I think so much of, our society, whether, something is working or not working really depends on what your perspective is. And unfortunately, the amount of resources you have, what level of power you have. And I think that's, probably how I would prefer to frame, that the problem identifies is how has the system been corrupted, either intentionally, unintentionally, with the best of intentions. And, as a result of that, what are we seeing now that should be fixed to make, this society better for everyone involved?
And I basically agree with Corinne on that, but I do see the system also being a problem itself in the sense that we've created a lot of different checkpoints, and maybe each one does have a reason for being there, but in practice, they can really add up in a way that makes it really hard to move projects forward, even when they're beneficial and supported projects. And from the public sector side, what I routinely see is not just one barrier, but many layers. CEQA is one of them. But along with the local policies, overlapping regulations, staffing constraints, and sometimes just the uncertainty about navigating the process. So I don't know that I'd call it a vitocracy outright, but I do think we have created a system that's better at asking questions than at delivering outcomes.
Anything to add, Matt?
Yeah, I can add a little bit. And this is a little bit from the legislative experience, but also a little bit of local government experience. One of the lines, I have lots of complaints about the book, but one that I actually really liked was a government that chooses is a government that works. And I feel like we have a system where a lot of officials don't want to make tough choices, and that ends up having a lot of downstream impacts. And so that, I think, is maybe not discussed as much in his telling of the book, is that people just don't want to make tough decisions in leadership positions. And so in that sense, it ends up being a little bit of stasis or maybe a vitocracy, but more just not a lot of urgency to act and get things done.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And I think, CEQA becomes kind of a scapegoat, I think, for the book, maybe less explicitly, because I think someone did a count and they mentioned CEQA maybe 6 times in the book, but certainly the discourse around it, where you hear a lot of the abundance agenda means we trash CEQA. And I don't think that's accurate or appropriate. And when you have exactly like Mindy described, a process where there are so many different stages involved, but really the most kind of public facing and the process that really a lot of the public has best access to is CEQA. So what that does is, make CEQA kind of the opportunity to thumbs up, thumbs down a project for people who are, maybe on the outside of the quote system. And that's not really what CEQA was intended to do. It was supposed to be, one tool to analyze, to identify, to give decision makers information to both, look at the impacts from a project, but also create a better project. And when you, look at what, kind of CEQA has become, we've really strayed pretty far away from that.
Yes. I'm not a CEQA practitioner, and I even know that. But we'll go on to the next question, and I'll start with you, Mindy. So does the abundance agenda leave out important perspectives, especially from disadvantaged or underrepresented communities?
I think that's a really important question. And one of the strengths of CEQA is that it creates a formal avenue for public input. And historically, it's been especially important for communities that don't always have other ways to be heard. But at the same time, in practice, not all the voices show up equally, right? The people who have the time, the resources, the familiarity with the process, and a lot of influence, they can really include well-organized neighborhood opposition and interest groups that take over the process. So I don't think that the issue with CEQA is the public participation itself. I think it's how it's structured. And if we're going to think about reform, the goal shouldn't be to reduce the participation, but to make sure the process is actually reaching out and reflecting the communities that are most affected by given projects.
Yeah, I think Mindy's absolutely right. And, while certainly our focus of discussion today is going to be, CEQA, environmental permitting, I do think it's worth highlighting that a lot of the basic premise of, the book itself is pretty widely disagreed with, especially amongst disadvantaged and underrepresented communities. It starts with the description of utopia itself. I think we're not going to see anywhere near 100% buy-in that is utopia. And, I keep trying to remind myself that what I think is a good project, especially as a renewable energy developer, isn't going to be seen as a good project to everyone, and certainly, communities that I don't represent. I think, that said, and I think a lot of the intent of this discussion is going to lead here is I think it's possible to maybe co-opt the abundance agenda and reframe it to, how and what we see as environmental professionals as needing improvements, needing reform. I think sometimes we can default to reform meaning weaken, and I don't think that's best for anyone. I think there's a way to improve, portions of CEQA adjacent environmental permitting so that we have more access for more people, while at the same time, making some common sense reform decisions that make it work better for everyone involved. So I know that's a big ask, but I do think that, we do have an opportunity here to utilize this abundance agenda and what legislators and, maybe our friends who don't quite understand what we do for a living are starting to talk about, and have something that works better. I want to note that to do so, we've really got to make sure that all voices are represented. And I don't think the book does that. And I know that even, us as this panel and even amongst AEP, we're struggling to do that as well.
Thank you. Anything to add, Matt?
Yeah, I think the book leaves out a couple of things. I mean, on my last comment, I was talking about how a lot of times government doesn't want to make tough decisions. Elected officials may not want to make tough decisions. He does kind of leave out the politics involved. And it's like, sure, you can make a tough decision that you upset your local labor union, and then they run a candidate against you 9 months later and you're out of office. So he leaves out kind of the consequences of making tough decisions, which I think is not fair to a lot of officials. And again, that's part of the system we've built. And that's kind of he doesn't talk enough about that part of it, I think. The other thing I think he leaves out a little bit is he kind of talks about it in the climate lens, but he kind of leaves out nature in the book. And he is very much like, we should just build, and we should be building housing. We should be building all these things in all these places. But he doesn't actually talk about the nature and wildlife and all of that consequences from just kind of a rapid building. So, which I think is a huge hole in the abundance argument.
Yeah, thank you all.
Maybe just want to just not spark this, but I don't even know that it's like, proven that abundance equals better. Like, does more housing mean that we're going to have affordable housing? Does, there's so many other factors at play. We can easily point to capitalism, easily point to, the way that some of these systems are structured, that I don't know that it's as certain as, certainly the authors make it seem that more is what's going to get us where we need to go.
Ooh, interesting. Okay. So now we want to get some audience feedback as you've heard their responses. And what we are talking about was, does the abundance agenda leave out important perspectives, especially from disadvantaged or underrepresented communities? And a lot of other nuggets in there. It's like leaving out the nature of politics and is more better. Excuse me. Sorry. Oh my gosh. Sorry, guys. And is more better. So audience, what do you guys think? Do you agree with that framing? Who thinks, what else are we missing? Do you agree with what the panelists said? Do you disagree? Someone please say something, because I need water.
We love disagreeing.
Hi, panel. Laurel Lee's here. Matt, I want to underline what you said. I think that you can't public review your way out of hard decisions. Oftentimes, decision makers are like, well, let's just engage more stakeholders. Let's just have another hearing. Let's do this or that and get more people to the table. Well, sometimes you're going to have a project where people support it and they don't want to come to the table anymore, and they don't need to be heard anymore. And they still find it very difficult to be leaders and drive to ground, taking action, making decisions. doing the things. I think they're motivated by fear instead of abundance. I think that sometimes development can be mysterious. And like we have to be able to communicate with each other and the decision makers and the CEQA document preparers together at the table. And sometimes the systems that we've created, I'm just thinking about the California Energy Commission CEQA program very specifically. When you file an application, you can't have an abundant discussion. You can't speak to the commissioners. It's an ex parte rule. And that was problematic because it's like you want to hear from everybody, but you can't hear from the applicant. You want to hear from everybody, but you can't hear from California Energy Commission staff until an appropriate hearing. And at that point, it's pretty late in the process. So I just want to underline you can't public review your way out of hard situations. I do also think that nature is not discussed in the book, like you said, and CEQA is meant to analyze and disclose and support decision making. And you can't analyze your way out of the fact that you're going to be disturbing land. And it just is what it is. So the system of CEQA allows for a statement of overriding considerations if you've got an impact. And that's the place where we put our economic analyses and we define it in numbers, millions of dollars here, taxes there, but we don't describe really the net environmental benefit of a project and how, as Mindy said, you can have an environmentally superior project that's the best and highest use of the land, but because it's disturbing land, it's inherently problematic. So I don't really have many solutions, just complaints.
Anyone else from the audience have anything that you'd like to add to the conversation? Okay, yeah, we got one more. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Alex Rangel. I'm one of our associate planners for the city of Escondido. I know since we deal directly with developers very often, the conversation usually is not around CEQA. It's mostly like we're identifying how we process it and then we move forward. A lot of the conversations we have had recently is mostly like, how does this pencil? Like the raw cost and then the raw benefit in the long run. It's not even whether or not the CEQA process would stymie or slow down. It's making sure the end result will be profitable, to be quite honest. I know we've seen a lot of apartment units change to condos because that's what's getting financed. We've seen a lot of commercial properties not happen because those types of commercials are no longer happening. Office use is no longer happening because of the work from home stuff that's been happening for the past few years. So it seems a lot more just raw bottom line from my experience, more than it does seem to be just whether or not like policy is going into play, as we've seen with policy being more liberal and lax as opposed to less.
Yes, there's a lot here with the abundance book and the abundance agenda and all the different components and factors that there's a lot of complexity. And panelists, do you guys have any follow-up to what was shared?
Well, I think it's interesting. That's something we, discussed a bit while we were prepping for this is abundance dead and is it being replaced by affordability? And what does that mean for, the type of discussion we're having now? And, I think certainly there's going to be consensus that there is an affordability crisis in California. And, how much can we apply, what abundance was trying to do to affordability? And that's where I think it gets probably even more complicated, where it's that still baseline question is, does more housing equal affordable housing? I don't know. Does more renewable energy equal affordable energy or affordable utility bills? I don't know. I think from my perspective, and similarly, as a renewable energy developer, we're a cost plus, industry. So, we're going to develop a project, we'll estimate how much it costs. And then at the end of the day, we have a hurdle rate that we need to meet. And it's not a huge percentage of profit on these projects. And even with that, we're passing on enormous amounts of costs to ratepayers. And when we're trying to look at what the interplay is with CEQA and other things, CEQA is by no means anywhere near the biggest line item on our projects. But there are things coming out of CEQA that that can lead there. And I think I'm a little bit talking into our next question. So
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Great segue. And thanks to those sharing. And quick reminder or introduction, I should say, for those who may have joined after we started, we're recording a podcast now. So, and this is an engaging conversation. So encourage audience discourse and participation. So just want to give a little reminder for that. So moving into this, and Corinne, I'll go ahead and start with you. So in your experience, how much of the delay we see is actually CEQA and how much is something else?
I think that, CEQA is a delay. It's also a, tool to, try and stop projects for any number of reasons, but it's by no means the only one. And if we're going to talk about, from my perspective, specifically renewable energy, what we see a lot more of in terms of, what is making projects more expensive, it's things like the California Endangered Species Act, or CEQA, and then Williamson Act. And again, looking at the lens where what I think is a good project isn't going to, have total agreement, but there is at least some consensus within the state that looking at, fallowed ag that either has no water available or has damaged soil is a great place to build solar. Unfortunately, right now, it is as expensive to build solar on fallowed ag as it is in wide open, relatively pristine desert. And it's because of things like the Williamson Act, because of CEQA, and the way that those regulations are currently being implemented and interpreted by most.
Mindy.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Corinne just said. And in my experience in the public sector, CEQA can be an issue, but we exempt and streamline a lot of projects, and we still have huge delays come from local policy requirements, coastal act consistency, infrastructure constraints, and mostly the complexity of getting projects financed and built, and particularly with housing. So the biggest barriers are often the cost, the market conditions, and the local land use decisions. One point from the book that did resonate with me is around that public funding and subsidies, and how they really call out that the level of paperwork, the oversight, the coordination required in order to access funding, and how that can be so substantial that it's a barrier to getting projects done. It's just not worth getting the funding from the government.
Matt.
Yeah, I think both of those are really good points. I mean, I think we can all agree that CEQA certainly doesn't speed up projects, but I think there is a causation question that is not always talked about a lot. So, for example, folks may remember SB 35 was the kind of the first big housing or infill housing streamlining bill. And, the proponents of that say that it's maybe built 9,000 or 10,000 units have fallen under the SB 35 streamlining since then. But I think there's a big question of how many of those would have moved forward under the traditional process too. So what is the causation there? I think the litigation side of CEQA is one thing, but also just the litigation side of projects is another. And so, we've seen in Sacramento a little bit, and this is getting ahead. I'll not go too far into this because we'll talk more about that later. But, there's a big conversation now about basically how long purchasers can sue, whether that's condo developments or new housing construction. And people are saying, oh, maybe that's this long-term ability to challenge these projects that's basically prevented condos, except for the ultra luxury condos, from being built in California for 40 years. So it's okay, maybe there's other things that are a bigger impediment to construction than just CEQA. And so a lot of the people that are really involved in Sacramento are kind of maybe we're done on the environmental streamlining side for housing. That's not the problem.
Yeah, and that, was maybe one of the parts of the book that I found myself maybe surprisingly kind of nodding my head along to, was when they talked about, how a lot of the public interest groups and, under Ralph Nader and stuff, brought on to protect consumers. But what ended up happening is they just sued the government over and over and over again. And that, I'm not naive enough to think the government's always going to act in the public's best interest, but at some point we have to, I think, look at, especially now reframing it into the CEQA space, what happens when all you're doing is writing, 3,000 pages to win a lawsuit instead of inform the public. And it it, creates, again, this, evolution of CEQA that I don't think matches both the intent or what it can live up to and what we can do. And I was at a discussion a couple weeks ago with Clean Tech San Diego and the San Diego Workforce Partnership, and they put up this slide of who is employed in the energy industry in San Diego. And 5/6 of respondents were either consultants or engineers. And when you look at, what it takes to take an energy project from, start, design, permitting, development, construction, operation, when 5/6 of those people are this, consultant engineering industry, it probably means we're spending too much money and time on what, your consultants are doing, what your engineers are doing. And I love my consultants and engineers. I could absolutely not get steel in the ground without them. But I do think, it's symptomatic of we're spending so much time and working on avoiding lawsuits, trying to, outthink litigation, that all of that time and energy is taking away from, can we have better mitigation options? Can we have technological solutions so maybe we do use less land? Can we, are we pigeonholing ourselves into a project that is big enough to sustain the level of these, development and permitting costs at the expense of what could be a better project?
Thank you. And so I'm going to ask the audience now. You guys are basically the fourth panelist collectively. So work together, breakout room. No, I'm kidding. Only because, we only have so much time. Otherwise, that would be fun.
I agree. I don't think CEQA is the bad guy in this situation for developers. I'm developing long duration energy storage. And as a developer, you're responsible for certain timelines and scope, schedule, budget so that you can get financed. And we can put CEQA, as Corinne said, as a line item, and it's not the biggest one. In our DevEx and in our CapEx, CEQA is never the biggest one. When you're building major energy infrastructure that the grid needs for reliability, then we talk about affordability. And the costs that get passed on to ratepayers, as Corinne is mentioning, is oftentimes CESA related. And I can point to the Willow Rock project on the California Energy Commission's docket, all public record, if you want to go browse the 1,500-page final staff assessment and final decision. It has a line item. It put $6.6 million of habitat mitigation lands condition on a project that permanently disturbs 89 acres for which there were negative protocol survey results. And what that indicates is that we needed to get a permit done to retain our ITC credit benefits that gets passed down to ratepayers. And we needed to have it done by a certain time. So we just accepted what the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and California Energy Commission opined was the best for biological resources mitigation. And we don't agree with it on a technical level. Our engineers and our consultants, as Corinne mentioned, could argue. And we could invest a lot of money in public hearings and debating the issue and having more discord and talking about it over and over again. And at some point, it didn't make any sense. It made financial sense, as our other commenter mentioned, to our bottom line to just accept it. But now we have this $6.6 million CapEx requirement that is, I would argue, not to the benefit of the public because the species aren't there. So we made a really tough decision. We made a environmental precedent in the region that is inconsistent with other projects built just a mile north of us. And it was unfortunately a consequence of the system and the timelines. I'll finish by saying it is also the California Public Utilities Commission procurement mandate timelines where developers need to have a commercially operable project to deliver energy to the grid by a certain date because the buyers have bought it to meet the CPUC mandates. But those timelines don't align with the California Energy Commission. They don't align with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They don't align with the federal government. They don't align with anything. So none of the timelines align, and it's incumbent upon the developer to make it work and to figure it out. It's really hard. And so it's not just CEQA. It's all the interagency agreements that often need to be put in place, memorandums of understanding so that we all don't get litigated. And it's quite exhausting, the bureaucracy that is carried forward to ratepayers, as Corinne is saying. So if we really want good, environmentally superior energy projects so we can keep the lights on, we have to figure out how to navigate an overly complex and bureaucratic process that doesn't lead to abundance at all.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. Anyone else have comments on delays? How much is actually CEQA and how much is something else? Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wrote an article about this in the Institute of Transportation Engineers, where the fire code is one of the primary things that's leading to scarcity when you're trying to design new communities, because you have all these well-meaning, good-sounding rules about designing wide lanes for fire trucks on local neighborhood streets. But that ends up with freeway-sized lanes and no room for trees in communities that really creates a scarcity. And that's something that I think the Abundance book really does a good job at, is like, where are the rules that are creating scarcity? And it creates a scarcity of everyday safety because you have fast speeds on local roadways instead of a great walkable environment. You have a scarcity of trees and like the benefits that provides for public health. It creates a scarcity of like land use tax revenue because you're creating a lot of infrastructure for less homes. And so thinking about what codes need to be reconsidered so that you get the outcomes that you are trying to achieve. And that is really the true kind of point of Abundance in trying to remove those bottlenecks like code or whatever it might be, whether it's CEQA or other things.
Now, I found your argument that you just made much more compelling than I think a similar argument the book made, which was maybe we don't need to have all the like fire safety requirements in affordable homes. And I thought that was like offensive, actually. Like, just because, we're trying to build affordable housing that is, somewhat achievable by members of the public. I think they also deserve to have safe houses. So your framing, I thought, was much better than what we saw in the book.
So I actually have a contrarian view to you. We're getting into it. I'm nervous. I don't like to argue. I'm like such a pacifist, but there was anecdotally, locally, so I'm not a planner, disclaimer, asterisk, all the things. But I was working with a company that was working on a transitional housing project in San Diego with the city of San Diego, and we were going to bid on it. And one of the roadblocks to bidding was the fire code. And currently, if you're in San Diego, I think it's called Lot O. It's right along the 5 freeway by downtown, that there's tents. And there's a lot of issues with the tents in this community because it's right on a canyon. So there's food, you get animals, there's nature there. The tents are soft-sided. What happens when you put that all together? It's something. It's better than absolutely nothing. And so this project, we were proposing hard-sided structures that were fire resistant up to an hour. And because they weren't 100% in compliance with the fire code, they're like, no, this won't work. It's like, well, the tents certainly are not upholding it or like compliant with the fire code. And so it was like, I agree with you, Corinne. It's not like I don't want to like, I think everybody deserves to have like safety, like basic needs met, like at a minimum. But it's kind of like the progress over perfection. Like, okay, well, this is a step in the right direction. It might not be perfect yet, but like we can get there. And there was some protection, but not within the fire code. So, okay. Yeah, thank you. For those that didn't pick up the mic, she said good story. So I just want to make sure that's captured on the podcast. All right. So I'm going to skip over for panelist reference the next question because I think we already covered that. Thank you. So California has been making targeted CEQA changes with housing, transit, clean energy. For the panelists, do you feel these are meaningful steps forward, or are we avoiding bigger structural reform? Mindy, we'll go ahead with you.
Yeah, we got to talking about this a lot when we were prepping and getting into the issues, and it comes to that incremental reform versus comprehensive reform question. I do think there's some value in making incremental changes like the ones we're seeing. They're often politically achievable, like what you were saying earlier about knowing the nature of politics. and they can make a difference for some specific types of projects. But at the same time, from a practitioner's perspective, I feel like those changes really start to become a patchwork that we end up with too many different rules depending on the project type rather than the system that's, creating a system that's predictable and consistent. And so that can really create its own challenges. I mean, navigating through a system that's really more complex, not less, as you're trying to put these band-aids on the bigger problem. And I do think the tension in that incremental progress is important to figure out, because we really risk layering on more and more exemptions without stepping back and asking whether the overall system is working the way we want it to and is getting healthier.
Thanks, Corinne.
Yeah, and I think a lot of my frustration with the incremental changes is that, probably only a fraction of them are actually useful. And then they get used as well, we've done this, so we're done. We can check off housing. Or, to Laurel's point, the gift to the energy industry was AB 205 and the opt-in process for certain energy projects. Absolutely no one wants to opt in to AB 205. It's really, really difficult. But then when, there are suggestions made for what could holistic reform look like or useful reform look like, it's no, you got AB 205, we're done. And going back to something I think we talked about earlier is I think that there could be this opportunity to do something meaningful, to do something bigger. And it's certainly not going to be only make things built easier. It's how to make things built better. And that is going to be added protections to places. It's going to be looking at, can we do big rewrites? And this is probably more optimistic than anything our legislator is capable of, especially right now. But, can we, what is in the realm of, maybe even impossible to bring in, all sides, most sides, and do something that is meaningful? Where do we need, social protections or social equity? What can we do to better include that into our quote system? And at the same time, what are common sense, CEQA reforms, and knowing that it's not, CEQA is not always going to be the vehicle to do both. In fact, it can't be the vehicle to do both. So can you get a better, consensus and modernization of what it takes to build projects we want to build in this state? And, what does that look like?
Yeah, I guess I agree with everything that's been said. I'll add a little bit. I think that the incremental improvements thing is, at least from a policymaker standpoint in the legislature, is seen as like pressure release valves. It's like pressure's building up on we're not building clean energy fast enough. So they do something small, release some pressure. Cool. We've at least done something. Housing, I think there was an enormous amount of pressure. And so it's been a lot harder to really actually release that pressure. And they've done a lot more in, say, housing, especially in like urban infill housing. I think the result is actually one of the things that I think Ezra Klein does a really good job of criticizing, which is just adding complexity and adding the need for more lawyers. His numbers on like how many lawyers per capita in the US versus all these other countries was, I thought, really fascinating. And these incremental changes just make it more complicated what process you're going to use and how to use it and all that kind of stuff, which just, it may help a certain set of projects, but you're going to need a bunch of more lawyers to figure out if you meet those certain set of criteria. So it's helpful from a pressure release standpoint, but it also is like further entrenching us in the world that I think he did a good job of criticizing, which is like a very complicated, very legal focused world. So
Yes, agree. And open it again, fourth panelists, audience. Hold on, we'll get you a mic. We got to get this on tape or whatever the equivalent of that is now.
Okay. Drew Sutton. I am in Sacramento. I guess I would say I'm actually starting to see a little bit of progress on what I've always seen as being sort of the fundamental problem with CEQA, which is that it applies to discretionary projects, and everything in California is discretionary. And so we have this huge, elaborate process that we go through because we want to make sure that everybody has input at every stage, rather than starting at the beginning and saying, this is what we want. These are the rules that get us there, follow the rules. And so it's been interesting to me at this conference in particular, because when all the housing bills passed a couple of years ago, I went, oh, I wonder if this is really going to do it, or the legislature is going to regret saying we've solved housing, we've fixed CEQA. And it's been impressive to see that actually it looks like that this is a way that people are trying to sort of set up rules that get you out of this sort of process do loop where do X, Y, and Z, here's what we want, build it, and we're happy. So I don't know, I'm maybe seeing a little bit of progress in that.
I like optimism. Yes.
Okay, maybe I'll have to dodge this question. But can you provide your thoughts on the Building an Affordable California ballot initiative? And
That's our next question.
can I lead you into your next question, Pierce, as a panel?
Oh, the agenda. No, actually, it's literally.
I didn't see that on the agenda. I'm sorry.
I'm teasing that you don't have it. Oh, look at that. Great. I'm getting these very lovely segues. This is just so natural. I love it. Thank you for asking. And so to add to what Darren said, there are proposals like the Building an Affordable California Act, or BACA, that would go much further in changing CEQA. What do you think proposals like that would change how CEQA works today, and what benefits and drawbacks do you see? So I'll start again with Mindy.
Yeah. Well, first, how many of you are familiar with this BACA initiative that's coming forward? Okay, I would say maybe 5, 6 hands out of the audience. So let me just tell you real quick. Like Jessa said, it is called the Building an Affordable California Act. It doesn't have all the signatures yet, but it is expected to get it. And it's a proposed ballot initiative that would streamline CEQA for a wide range of essential projects like housing, energy, and infrastructure. It aims to reduce delays by compressing timelines and limiting legal challenges. And it would speed up approvals, but also substantially change how review and public participation work under CEQA. And Corinne, I'm going to have you set us up first, and then I'll give my 2 cents on it.
So I think BACA definitely gets a couple things right. The elimination of the fair argument standard is something that AEP has endorsed and has been working with legislators to try to implement. I do think that, BACA itself falls into the same trap of overcomplicating CEQA reform. When you have, certain projects having to meet certain checklists in order to take advantage of, let's say, doing an MND, it's overcomplicating it. I think that, when we want to move back into what could be clear, concise, make things work better, one of the things that, again, we've been a proponent of is just across the board elimination of the fair argument standard. I think from a developer standpoint, having some idea of dates, times certain is really helpful. I'm sure pretty much everyone in this room knows that the CEQA statute itself actually dictates timelines to complete CEQA, with, 1 year being an EIR and 180 days for an MND. And I would like to see a show of hands of who routinely hits these CEQA schedules.
0 hands.
Well, 1. We got 1 in the back.
Oh.
That's impressive.
Okay.
The commenter's response was that he doesn't do housing, and that's how he's able to achieve those deadlines. But I think, one thing that I found interesting in the proposal, and that we kind of keep coming back to here, is it really does try to answer some of the questions of what is a good project, what is a bad project. And I don't know that I necessarily agree with everything it calls a good project and, worthy of what it believes to be benefits of BACA. But it's hard because that's, ultimately we want to be able to easily block, obstruct things that we don't want to see built. And we want it to be easier, cheaper, better for things that we do. And, it's easy to set up here and say we, but there isn't going to be consensus. Something that I want built is something that, another, person isn't going to want built. So it's always that push and pull of, how can this be improved in a way that makes sense for everyone?
Well, I'm going to come at it from a public sector, local jurisdiction standpoint, because a lot of people, when they look at what's proposed in the BACA, they're seeing how it will help the project limit the scope of review and the litigation, and it may reduce overall delay for the project. But from a local agency perspective, we're already operating under this growing number of shot clocks all the time. So for housing, other permits, various state requirements. And so you layer something like this on top of that, and for more complex projects as well, that's not less work. So maybe it's less time for some people for the overall project, but it's a lot less flexibility when issues come up and we're going to be under the gun. We're so understaffed. There's no way that we could meet all those timelines. We're really stretched thin already. And I just think, is it a question of whether or not it really speeds things up? We need to think about how it really would affect our day-to-day reality of getting projects done right and getting the right decisions made. And I'm going to tee it off to Matt about what you're seeing in the legislature in the Sacramento area for this.
Actually, I just want to speak out of turn real quick because you sparked something, Mindy. But I think to her very good point, adding a shot clock for the sake of adding a shot clock doesn't help anyone, even a developer. And when my only, avenue is then to sue the person from whom I am asking permission to do something, a shot clock isn't helpful to her. It really isn't helpful to me.
Mm-hmm.
And, we do have examples of, presumptive, granting of permits. We see that with the California Fish and Game Code and streambed alteration agreements. So if you're really going to put, our wonderful public staff members who are so overworked and largely, undervalued, at least have it be something meaningful at the end where, you're not then forcing someone who's in large part trying to work with them to then have to turn around and bring them to hearing or sue them. That just doesn't make any sense.
Thank you, Corinne.
Yeah, I think, speaking to pressure release valves, and maybe those have not been done enough. And now this is a result, is that this will probably be on the ballot. I'll get to the process in a minute just to kind of walk folks through it. But, I think they taken individually, there's a lot of good things in BACA from my personal view. I do think it's going to be a really dramatic change if you as a project proponent are willing to take the steps that the bill requires, which is essentially hiring union labor. Then you kind of open the door to a much more truncated process that you as a developer largely control, as opposed to the lead agency being in control. You as the developer have to pick the alternative to review. You only have to do that one. And then court really can't tell you no afterwards. They can't stop a project. And so taken all together, there's a lot of very significant kind of shifting of rights and power in the process from this that I think are going to be really significant. To go to kind of the legislative Sacramento view of this, I mean, there's certainly lots of people that support it. Obviously, it's getting funding. And there are some legislators that think it's a good idea, those that have really been aggressively kind of anti-regulation for a long time. And that's some on the Democratic side and obviously some on the Republican side too. I think there's plenty of legislators that oppose it outright. There are legislators that are trying to undo things that the legislature's already done. And so this goes, 10 steps further. So are certainly opposed. Process-wise, the measure is submitting signatures right now to show that it's met its threshold, and it appears it has collected enough valid signatures to be on the ballot. We have this kind of funky process in Sacramento whereby you can withdraw a ballot measure after it's qualified, basically up until the date that the Secretary of State needs to actually start printing our ballots, and so that usually falls around the last couple of days of June, and so. In theory, there can be a legislative compromise that gets passed and then signed by the governor, and then whoever's the proponent of the ballot measure will withdraw that from the ballot. It happens every year. There's usually a handful of these kind of compromise deals that get reached. In theory, something like that might be possible here. I think the big question is really whether, if you're the California Chamber of Commerce who's pushing this and the folks who have supported it, why? If you think you have the public support for this, why make a compromise? And so I think it'll be really interesting to see if there is environmental opposition that grows to it or other kind of more robust opposition that starts to get organized ahead of June to see if that makes, the proponents feel a little bit nervous about taking this to November. But if they're not feeling nervous, they'll probably move forward. And I think the legislature would welcome a compromise. I think the legislature tends to not like things going to the ballot because it means that they can't change it. They don't have control over it. So we'll see if opportunity gets given to them.
So should voters reach out to their legislative reps then?
Voters should always be reaching out to their legislative reps.
I'll add my uninformed opinion is that as a layperson, like looking at BACA, I'm like, oh, this looks great. Like, I don't understand all the impacts, which I think goes to Matt's point earlier about the level of complexities required to understand the real impacts of these decisions. But looking at it, it's very fluffy. I'm like, oh yeah, this sounds great. This should be faster and easier. Why not? And so I think that's going to be, and a lot of people outside of this room, do not understand CEQA. So anyway, on that note, I want to ask the audience again for your feedback. And so we were talking about BACA and what benefits and drawbacks do you see and how that would change, proposals like that would change it. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you again. I feel like this is one of those things where we keep seeing like this incremental legislation. We keep seeing these things that keep adding to our task load. Myself and my colleagues as public sector, we're getting more work. We're getting a requirement to do work faster. We're doing all of these extra additions, extra things we personally haven't analyzed. We're still trying to learn and not compensated or provided a help to do so. Like our staff is roughly like 10 or 12 planners, and this is providing more and more work, more and more threshold, more and more stress when I have to do a better job now because I have less time. And I have to do a more concentrated job because it's streamlined. I have to do a specific job. I can't miss anything because of one bite at the apple. It's creating more stress without releasing that valve. The valve is getting tighter in this case as opposed to releasing it. And it's kind of hard.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that perspective. Oh,
I was going to say, I think that's a really good point. Again, Abundance doesn't talk too much about this. And I think, frankly, the legislature doesn't talk enough about this, is just resources for local agencies. So the same folks who are pushing for projects to move faster and getting rid of regulations and, green tape, red tape, all of that, are also advocating against, the ability for local agencies to raise taxes and have more resources through fees, to have the staff to review these things faster. It's not like people at local agencies want to sit around and like review a project for 13 months. It's like, just I've got 14 other projects to review before yours. So yeah, it's a really good point.
And the budget reflects that, right? What we've seen draft versions of the state budget so far and how that rolls down into, local levels as well is we're seeing reductions in staffing.
Laurel here again. Earlier, I made a joke that I don't have any solutions, just complaints. I think one solution that we as an industry can do together is encourage developers to hire full-time planners, CEQA and NEPA practitioners, land use and environmental planners, and environmental permitting specialists like Corinne and me. We were environmental consultants. We were raised by AEP. We're high-performing, experts. And the reason why this is beneficial is because when a developer has a planner and staff, we can come and have a conversation with public agency staff and see what work we can do for them. And when a developer has an individual that has an MBA and not a planning degree, not environmental studies degree, having conversations with planners, they're just coming to you with pencils and bottom lines, and that's not telling the complex story or the holistic story of a project. And when you have a planner that works for a developer, you can come to a public agency and go to stakeholders and build a better project description, and maybe one that lays the story of strategic alignment, like the mission of this organization is X, the, legislature passed this thing, the procurement mandates of the CPUC are this, I'm trying to get financing from the federal government, this is it. And you have a conversation with human beings about, hey, I'm a developer, these are all the timelines I have to meet. There's no cost recovery for you to do some of the things. What can I do within the bounds of legality? If you're having a third party environmental review, I can't do all the things for you. I really wanted to just write the environmental document for the public agency and just do it. So maybe AI can do that for us. Maybe AI can write the environmental documents, and then you just review, make it better, put your mark on it. I didn't get to go to the AI session,
so I'm probably speaking out of turn, but I find that human beings who understand the regulatory complexity and understand the public agency complexity and understaffing can have a conversation, multiple conversations. Then you go to the decision makers and you're like, we all talked. And this is what we're finding. Here are actual challenges, decision maker. You don't need to worry about these things that aren't under dispute, but like these things, we actually need you to focus your decision making on, not these other things, because we got it.
Thanks for sharing.
I'm going to tear off of that and give like 2 quick shameless plugs.
Dang it.
The first,
The great segue.
sorry, Jasmine.
It's fine.
I mean, the first is I completely endorse, and that's self-serving, this is not going to be one of the 2 shameless plugs, what Laurel said, in that using things like an AEP conference where we can have applicants, staff, consultants, agencies all together, like having these brainstorming sessions, I think is so, so, so important, because ultimately we're the ones on the ground and we're the ones doing a lot of work. And I think that there are so many different things that we can, do together to improve things. And then, so shameless plug number 1, that was AEP. Come to your webinars, listen to podcasts, check out your local chapters, see what gatherings are there, because we have a lot of, I think, power, especially now with regulations being all uncertain, federal level, lesser or different factors at the state level, but like us as professionals have power and we can work together to make at least some improvements that help all of us. And then second shameless plug-in, as an example of what Laurel said, is the Large Scale Solar Alliance worked loosely with California Department of Fish and Wildlife to create an ITP, an incidental take permit application template. And we, LSA, put it on our website. It is accessible to any industry, anyone working on an ITP. It's going to have the most relevant for solar in terms of like what's in a project description, but you can take what's there and use it for whatever the project is. And the fact that industry could do that with assistance and guidance from CDFW meant that it's now available, it's public, it's not an underground regulation if CDFW had done that on their own. And it has a nearly 100% success rate in getting deemed complete within 30 days. So even, without widespread reform, without, asking our friends in Sacramento to like do something, there is a way that literally the people in this room can take some pressure off staff by giving them something in the format they need, relying on our consultants to do that, having an applicant who understands the process. And that's just one tiny example of how we can make it a little bit better, I think, tearing perfectly off of what Laurel said.
Okay, you guys worked ahead, so that's great. So what should be done? They already told us. No, I'm kidding. We'll go ahead and go back through the questions and open it up, of course, for more feedback from the audience. And so, as we know, and this has seemed to be a theme throughout, the book does not really offer real guidance or solutions. And so if we're going to fix this in a coherent, not piecemeal way, what should California actually do differently? So I'll start with Mindy, unless you want to start with Matt. You look like you were mulling it over.
Yeah, I am. I'm mulling this one over still. I mean, I think one of the biggest opportunities here is to focus on how the different pieces of the system work together and focus on those, connections. Project outcomes right now, they're not just shaped by CEQA, as we've said over and over. It's shaped by zoning, funding, infrastructure, various policies. So I think, I don't have any silver bullet. Nobody has a silver bullet solution, but looking at environmental review overall and the need to think more holistically about how do we support the types of projects we say we want, housing and climate infrastructure, and can we include more consistent funding tools to get at those things and establish clearer standards across the board, and not just, add more shot clocks and front load the things we want and then make everything else in the back of the line and everything else on the back burner. So I don't know, that doesn't really sound like a solution, but that's kind of, I think, what we all need to collaborate to do and to review. What do you think, Matt?
Again, I am not a project developer, so take this with a grain of salt. This is coming more from, my view as a lobbyist. And, I help project proponents who are trying to get grants and go through that process and leverage federal funds and all that kind of stuff. So I think the biggest solutions are actually totally outside of the CEQA, or the biggest needs for review are outside of the CEQA lens. Things, and I think, bringing it back to the book, I think Ezra Klein notes a couple of really good examples here. I think he uses the CHIPS and Science Act, but I worked on a lot of other federal grants that came out of the Biden years. And it was incredible how many kind of new things they wanted a project developer to solve with their project. Local hiring and job training and all kinds of community benefit agreements and all kinds of stuff that are good things. But a lot of these projects, the big infrastructure projects, have been in development for 10, 15, 20 years. And a lot of stuff is kind of already settled. A lot of the folks that I was working with have already gone through CEQA, so they can't change their project anymore. And asking a project developer to kind of take on and try and solve all these other little issues locally, whether it's training, job training, or education-related things, stuff like that, I just don't think is the right fit. And I think that is actually holding up projects much more than just environmental review, which, there's whole conferences, all kinds of professionals dealing with CEQA and how to do environmental review. Like, we've kind of figured out how to get projects through that for the most part. It does take time, but having a project solve like kind of all kinds of other social issues, I think gets really complicated and really challenging. And I think, kind of to echo one thing that I think Ezra said really well, is like, a chips manufacturer from Taiwan is not the best suited person to figure out how to do local hiring and education in some community that they've never been in before. And it's like, couldn't sum it up better. So I do think, like, looking at all the little qualifiers that we put on public money and put on projects that are not related to the project would be a really good place to start. Also, I will say, one other kind of like thing that outside of CEQA that I think really needs review is land acquisition, eminent domain type stuff, easements, especially for bigger infrastructure projects that are crossing tons of boundaries. Ezra Klein spends a lot of time on high-speed rail, which is an example, but making it easier or at least quicker for that to happen, I think would give projects much, much better, especially public, like necessary infrastructure projects, much more support than CEQA fixes.
I'm going to focus on CEQA fixes, or at least environmental permitting fixes. But I mean, maybe before that, just big picture, I think two things to what Matt said is I completely agree that we're asking CEQA to do too much. I think what's tough is that no one's willing to take on social equity. So if it's not being done at the project level, where can it be done, and how can we bring the people to the table who have never been brought to the table in order to have those fixes, which are desperately needed? And a good friend of mine said while prepping for this interview is, how much are we leaving behind that very real concern by focusing on, what a CEQA fix is, what an environmental permitting fix is. And it's important not to lose sight that needs to happen and isn't. But to look at, what could or should, be done. And again, in my renewable energy space, like, CESA's not working. We aren't bringing species back from the brink of extinction. They're not recovering. We're not getting more species. We're not doing it well at all. We're seeing in almost all of our listed species, numbers continue to decline. Where we have seen species rebound is really through actions that had nothing to do with CESA. So I think we need to look at how can CESA be implemented to actually work, and what can we do both within the framework of what we have existing, and also, probably make some hard decisions on legislative fixes as well. I, brought up Williamson Act in addition to CESA, and that's something that, again, if we want to take advantage of what, has, I think, widespread buy-on on land that can't be farmed, how do we incentivize putting solar farms on that? And, what could or should be done to incentivize landowners, to incentivize, people surrounding those landowners, developers, et cetera. And I think where those two concepts really come together is once you build large scale solar, and if you make some just, kind of small tweaks to how you manage vegetation and do operations for those, you actually improve habitat from what was there before. And you increase species abundance. You make a better home for some of our listed species like burrowing owl, like crotches, like Swainson's hawk. Right now, the way that our policies are is you disincentivize doing that, because then not only am I going to have to worry about those species during operations, if they then come into my site, I have to, fully mitigate for that. When I'm creating habitat, I'm providing habitat, but I still can't get take coverage without then that $6.6 million or more when you're talking thousands and thousands of acres that Laurel mentioned. So I think my big ask is how can we bring enough groups to the table to look at common sense reform to let, again, in my renewable energy realm, let solar convert fallowed ag into beneficial, improved habitat for not only our endangered species, but, species that are maybe 3, 4, 7, 10 years away from being on the brink of endangered. And, we've kind of danced around a little bit, but climate change is just such a huge threat to all of us, what we're doing. And that has to play into how we're asking for this modernization or this big, policy overhaul to, really make, I think, discrete changes in the next, 3, 5, 10 years, because I'm worried, and this is maybe where my optimism turns to pessimism, is like, I don't know what this is going to look like in 10 years or 30 years or 60 years. And I think a lot of the urgency that we've seen around the, popularity of abundance is we need to do something, like something needs to change, and it needs to happen very quickly.
Mic drop. So are there other parts of CEQA, like you mentioned CSA, but are there other parts of CEQA, like the fair argument standard, that should be reconsidered? Or is that the wrong place to focus when we're talking about maybe a lot of other things, a lot of other problems and challenges that we need to face?
Well, actually, yeah, I know we've talked about all these other things being also the problem, and not just CEQA, but we've danced around the real one of the real problems with CEQA is that we're at a point where most of the analysis we do is driven by what will hold up in a legal challenge rather than what's most informative for decision makers and meaningful for the public and the community to understand. So from practitioners' point of view, two things would really shape that dynamic or continue to shape it right now. And that's the fair argument standard, as well as who has standing to bring a challenge in CEQA. The fair argument standard, it as you all know, sets a low bar for requiring a higher level of review. And in practice, it leads us to analysis that's all about risk management than about the environmental outcomes. And even if a project is never challenged, the possibility of a challenge is what influences how we prepare the documents right from the beginning. It overshadows everything. And then standing, that plays into it because CEQA allows this broad range of parties to participate in challenge projects, and that reflects that history and purpose in CEQA, but it also means that the process is now used in ways that aren't tied to any environmental concerns. And, we have unions and people with very different agendas that use CEQA challenges. And again, that overshadows everything from the very beginning. So when we ask, why is it so hard to move forward even on projects that have those great benefits, a lot of it comes down to managing just the legal risk. And at some point, that's where it starts to feel like that's why we can't have nice things.
I think I'd maybe add two things kind of specific to, one is I think kind of specific to CEQA, but it's Cortese list issues and trying to figure out some sort of pathway to get projects off of that and into all the CEQA streamlining that they would then otherwise be eligible for. So I think that is definitely, especially because I think we all agree we should be doing more infill, and the purpose of CEQA should be to drive stuff towards infill, but then you don't have accessible land or available land for all the streamlining because of a Cortese list or otherwise. I think it's also the way it's set up. You're just having sites that are never getting cleaned up because no one is taking on the risk to clean it up if they don't know that they're going to be able to develop a project there. So I think that's a really huge one, would be Cortese list improvements. The other, and this is just a small one, but why is aesthetics in CEQA? Like,
Yeah.
I think there should be some looking at the checklist and the items that are on there, and like, are all these actually focused on projects and nature and the purposes that CEQA is there to protect? And aesthetics has always jumped out to me as like a crazy one. So, and I know it opens up a lot of litigation, and a lot of people sue on aesthetics. So yes, that'd be my one piece that should be removed from CEQA.
And the aesthetics can be addressed through other things like your policies, the Coastal Act. All those things already get at it. So why do we have to add on top of it? Yeah.
And I think maybe marrying the two is with the elimination of the fair argument standard, maybe I don't have to have 450 pages of analysis of air quality impacts from a solar project that has virtually zero operational emissions.
And I'll do a quick little plug for the podcast, Environmental Leadership Chronicles, on all major podcast players. So if anyone wants to pull up their phone and follow it right now, I'm watching. Just kidding. But we do have a very recent episode where Matt and Corinne and Kristen Blackson joined to talk about the fair argument standard specifically. So if you're interested in learning more, it's out, available. Did I see a hand up?
Hi, my name's Abdul Fletchgar. I'm principal planner at the City of Wildemore. It's the smallest jurisdiction in western Riverside County. I would say I agree with a lot of the things about, for example, affordability. You have these, bills like SB 35, and a lot of projects haven't been built. If you want to build affordable housing, one thing I would say is a lot of these bills require, for example, stuff like prevailing wage, which adds a big layer of cost to a lot of these affordable housing projects. And how affordable are they when, unfortunately, they're not being built? We do live in a capitalist society where, supply and demand, right? The more you build, theoretically, the cheaper things get. But it comes to a limit where we're not even really building that many units because of the fact that it is really expensive to build, because a lot of these requirements, for example, fire requirements, and yes, people deserve to live in safe houses, like 7A requirements and all that. But you have all of these arbitrary requirements that maybe like aesthetics, for example, all of this that add a lot of cost to projects that maybe don't require all of that. And developers at the end of the day, all of these developers obviously want to make a profit, right? So, and if they're not making profit, it doesn't pencil out, and stuff we have to deal with. We have a staff of 2, so we have a lot to deal with. So when it comes down to that, we don't see a lot of projects come through the pipeline because of the fact that at the end of the day, it's just really expensive to build, and with construction costs going up, and it's just not feasible for a lot of these projects to really even build anything. You have for example, recently there was a project that was proposed that, we were talking with the developer and they wanted to build some for sale units. However, there's a small vernal pool in the middle of the project with some fairy shrimp, and, mitigating that would have costed several $1 million. So, the project is dead, and that property is going to stay vacant for a long period of time. So really not benefiting anyone. Also, I would say incremental reform is really, I think, very useful because of the fact that we kind of go back to the politicians not wanting to make really heavy decisions, right? Because they're afraid of not being reelected. But it also, if we want to have effective incremental changes, it falls on the organizations like AEP, APA, California cities to keep putting pressure on the legislator to, have effective incremental changes. Thank you.
Thank you.
No pressure bat.
I was going to say, I'll add a quick, while you're ready to go, a quick anecdote is that I, one time in a room full of biologists and ecologists, said, what's the big deal with berry shrimp? Like, it's a mud puddle. And I learned.
I was just going to add that we talked about in the the leadership panel that we had at the beginning of the conference, when we broke people into groups, what makes a good leader? Accountability was like a theme across all the groups. And I would say every good project that I've seen fail has failed because the local jurisdictional decision makers didn't have any accountability. So even though the project had resolved all the impacts, which is what CEQA was supposed to do, good projects like, bridge project, bridge or housing project being paid for by a private organization. I watched that project go to the city council, and I saw 2 members of the community get up and say, it shouldn't be in our city. It should be in Beverly Hills. Why doesn't Beverly Hills have to do this project? All the people that needed that housing were from that community. And no one on that city council had the guts to say, because our community members need this project. And that's why we should do it here. And we have someone that's willing to provide the property, willing to build it, willing to provide service for our community. So I don't know how you legislate that, but it's not just the state legislature. We have a lot of decision makers who really aren't doing their job under CEQA. They're supposed to look at the CEQA document, the cost of the project, and its impacts on the community, but they're making decisions based on 1 or 2 voices in the community. That's problematic.
And one up front. So we're just jumping into questions and comments.
Oh.
So, no, you're fine.
I was going to tag on a story about visual resources. Again, the Willow Rock project in Eastern Kern County, the final decision and our 175 conditions are publicly available if you want to go look through it. It's 75 pages of bio mitigation. The only potentially significant and potentially unmitigable impact was visual resources, because you're building a power plant, some turbines, turbo machinery in a desert. So people driving down Caltrans freeway are going to see something that is there that wasn't there before. And, that is going to follow the project everywhere it goes as having a potentially significant impact, even though it was a statement of overriding considerations and the findings are quite nice to read. That has always really stuck with me, that this project is environmentally superior. It's by design, by technology. It's no greenhouse gas emissions, no groundwater use, 50-year asset. 500 megawatts for 8 hours could power the entire city of Bakersfield for 8 hours straight. It is a project that has 0 opposition. Not one individual has vocalized opposition. Full stakeholder support and unanimous decision. But visual resources was an impact that no community member said we're going to have a visual impact. It was the California Energy Commission staff that said you're going to have a visual impact. Nobody else in the community was like, I don't want to see that there. They said, I want to see that there. I want that thing there. So that is just an anecdote. Maybe we can case study or workshop as an industry on, Williamson Act to get solar, getting aesthetics out of CEQA, or these incremental improvements that would actually really reduce costs and streamline review and de-risk a project instead of creating unnecessary risk that gets passed on to ratepayers.
Thank you. In the back. Here we go. We're going to be held accountable now.
Oh, you sure are.
No, cut the mic. I'm just kidding.
So, and sorry for talking so loud because that speaker's really loud. But it's sort of it's a question and a comment. So it's a couple of things in a row. But I want to sort of ask rhetorically, who doesn't like regulations? Who doesn't like wage and workplace regulations? Who doesn't like food safety regulations, right? Who doesn't like environmental regulations? When we're talking about reform, we're talking about a 40-year project of deregulation that's been happening in this country. And if you accept the framing that a significant problem is regulation itself, you are accepting the role of being a mark in a long con. You are not allies in making a better system. We are arguing over inches, especially with housing, when the problem is measured in miles. And I don't know if this is the right amount or the right way to put that limited amount of time and energy we have into focusing on those inches. There was a study that came out recently that said if we eased all the regulations that constrain housing in San Francisco, it would take 100 years before housing prices matched income. And it's because we've accepted the framing that the problem is regulation, not the underlying social, financial, and wealth inequity. And yet here we are. And I want to say, if you don't see housing as a human right, I'm not sure I would even be willing to sit at the same table as anyone, because it means we don't share the same moral standard for human equity and human life. So what are we doing here with this kind of conversation? And so here's the question. Who you listen to is who you value. In the book, and to some degree even Matt on this panel, dismissed the regulations about job training and making sure that there was equity in contracting for disabled people, marginalized people, working class people, Black and brown people, women. Something is dismissed as too costly, too expensive, too slow. The analysis of the book, and except for some, little remarks in passing, doesn't include social inequities in its analysis. And even Ezra Klein in the introduction generalizes a utopia that does not include the needs of Black, brown, queer, and disabled people. What if for us, utopia is somewhere where we can actually live and have basic human rights and civil rights and social access? Ezra doesn't even mention that in his analysis. There's a recent study, and I was talking to Mindy and Corinne about this the other day, that said how people view other social groups, and that environmentalists, and everyone in this room is considered environmentalists just because of your profession, do not care about the same issues that Black and brown and working class people care about. And so, again, who you listen to is who you value. So I'm looking at the guys who wrote this book and how they wrote. I'm looking at this panel on stage. I'm looking at this room. I'm looking at this conference. I'm looking at the board of AEP. So the question is, does AEP value Black, brown, and other marginalized communities?
Well, I certainly hope we do. I mean, that's where we're trying to go. We're trying to build a community with AEP. So I certainly hope so.
I mean, I'll say yes. As with the podcast, especially, we try to feature diverse voices on there and show people from different walks of life, different backgrounds, different ethnicities, all the things to show like who all makes up the environmental. Like you said, we're all lumped in as environmental leaders, even though everyone, as we've heard today, has like very different roles and jobs within that, even though this is organized around CEQA and planning. But there's a lot of different jobs even within that subsector. So anything to add for you guys?
I mean, I think a strong yes, but we all need to do better.
Yeah.
We all need to do it better.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'll say in response to the item about that I had mentioned about, the qualifications get them put on projects around job training and stuff like that. I actually think those are critical, super important. I think, and I did not do a good enough job explaining kind of what my thinking was there. I do wonder if a project is the best place to do those things versus having government actually offer those systems on a holistic basis. An individual project might be able to stand up, say, one little training program at a community college. That's great, but that project is going to fund maybe a tiny portion, and maybe it funds that for 2 years or 3 years or something like that. Whereas really we need government to step in and create a much bigger footprint of these type of training programs and equity programs and stuff like that I frankly think government is failing at. I don't know that it's the best to put that on a project to solve those problems, but I think we should be making government much, much, much more effective creating those equity-focused programs.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. I'm local.
Yeah.
About that, from my work in this state and in other states, developers won't pay for anything unless you force them to. Okay, so a way to get them to reinvest in the communities, which long-standing was like the wealthy populations had let's say, a moral obligation to provide for their local community in so many ways. We don't see that anymore. And so it falls back to how can we, not just government regulation, but how can governments instill the requirement for these things to exist, such as equality in hiring and hiring locally and that sort of thing, and using projects as a methodology. And I feel pretty strongly that without some of those things, developers kind of skate through. And, it's kind of getting something back for allowing a large development. In my hometown, a Walmart was being proposed for a an outside of the city, kind of in a suburban area, but in a farmland area. And it boiled down to they could get approved if they hired locally, if they did some farmland mitigation and all of these other things, because otherwise, a lot of people who are very, let's say, development forward would say, yeah, bring them in, because it's, it's a good thing to have a Walmart in our community. But then the developer, and it's happened so many times, where they just given it on a platter rather than asked to provide to the community. My 2 cents.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And I just want to say we're a little bit over time. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much to everybody for joining and participating. This was so much fun. And for those who are ready to step out after an hour and a half, feel free. But I don't know if we can keep talking the conversation going because it's been fantastic. So
yeah,
I just want to give a pause for those who, and I don't know if there's another panel in here afterward. Yeah. There is. Okay.
Maybe
one more.
Real quick, final thoughts. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to say to dares to do, we can do this. And come on, you Spurs, getting big 3 points this morning.
Thank you all so much.
Top that. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to be updated when new episodes are released and leave us a review to let us know what you think. It also really helps us to share the podcast with others who may enjoy learning about the environmental industry. If you want to submit a shout out or any feedback, please send an email or voice memo to podcast@califaep.org. The email again is podcast with an S, podcast@califaep.org.